welcome everybody. Very warm welcome to this microdosing webinar. Now, I'm Jo Neal, and this is our 25th Street Drugs webinar. We started in the pandemic, and they've been going strong ever since. And we haven't had a webinar on psychedelics for a very long time, since really we started these. So it's well overdue, I think. The next one is in May, and it's on CBD. So today's event will be recorded, and it will be hosted on James Morgan's YouTube channel and on the Drug Science website. So there's no panic if you have to leave early. And do tell all your friends and colleagues if they couldn't make it, because it's like a lovely day. We have a really relaxed format, and there's plenty of opportunity for you to ask questions. And I've certainly got quite a lot of questions about microdosing. So what I would like to ask you to do, though, is to put your questions in the Q&A rather than in the chat. It's very hard for me to keep track of the questions if they're everywhere. So and if you put them in the Q&A, then the presenters can answer them online as well for you, which is really helpful. Okay, so we're discussing microdosing with 3 experts today. And the discussion will range from how we can test for effects of microdosing, how we can evaluate the evidence. Does it work? Is there a benefit? What are the risks? Does the benefit outweigh any potential risks? We'll be looking at a phase 1 trial and other controlled studies to answer these questions to see really what does microdosing do and how does it do it and how does it work? Does it work? So I'm really delighted actually to introduce Professor Harriet DeWitt to you as the first speaker, who's actually on her holidays, and she's popped into the University of Calgary to do this for us. So we're very grateful, Harriet. Thank you very much. And as a PhD student, I read Harriet's work, so this is a real treat for me. So she's a professor and founder and director of the Human Behavioral Pharmacology Lab at the University of Chicago. She's a consultant to the FDA, the American Food and Drug Administration, and she serves on several scientific advisory boards. She has received several honors and awards for her research, and her main focus is physiological subjective, so that's mood altering, so she's in absolutely the right place here, and the behavioral effects of drugs in healthy human volunteers. And she is now running controlled trials in her laboratory on the effects of microdosing. So very warm welcome to this webinar, Harriet, and thank you for giving up your time.
Thank you, Jo. Thanks for the introduction, and it's a real pleasure to be here. So nice to see my co-participants, and I'd love to see the audience, but I can see your chat anyway. So do you want to go ahead and start the first slide, Jo?
I will, yes, share my screen then.
Okay. All right. Next slide, please. All right. So question is, what is microdosing? And most of you probably already know it's using low doses of LSD and sometimes other psychedelic drugs once every 3 or 4 days. And the claims are that it improves mood and cognition and creativity and many other things as well. People use doses about 1/10 of a psychedelic tripping dose. This practice is very widespread, and it's had a great deal of publicity, as I'm sure you know, but there have been few controlled studies to really to determine what the effects are. Next slide, please. So the area has been led by a lot of public interest, as I said, and there are already these 10 books that have been written about microdosing, even without any really systematic controlled experimental evidence. And they make quite remarkable claims. You can see here that it heals trauma, improves performance, improves physical and mental health, enhances creativity, healing, and recovering. So there are a lot of quite grandiose claims, and it's our job as pharmacologists to try and figure out which of these actually have merit or occur, and which ones are just a result of some public hype or public interest. So next slide. So it's our job as pharmacologists to figure this out. So the question is, does it work? And there are reasons both to be skeptical and also to be optimistic. On the optimistic side, it's so popular that you think there must be some merit to it and must be doing something beneficial. There are also plausible neural mechanisms. So the LSD acts on brain structures that make it feasible that it would have beneficial effects, even as single and repeated doses. The high doses of psychedelic drugs are promising in the treatment of depression and a range of other psychiatric disorders. And there's also some promising preclinical or laboratory animal evidence that supports this idea that microdosing has beneficial effects. On the other hand, there's also reasons to be skeptical. That is, there are very strong expectancies. So nobody microdoses without having some kind of expectation of what it's going to do and how it's going to affect their behavior. So, and we don't know, and it's difficult in the natural world to control those expectancies. The mechanisms by which the drug actually acts are not known. And of most concern to me, really, is the heterogeneity of the claimed benefits. So the next slide, I've already alluded to this, but the next slide, there you go. Here are some of the claimed benefits that people have claimed. You can see creativity, increased energy, productivity, focus. I don't need to reveal all mindfulness, wisdom, and then decreased depression, anxiety, and even menopausal symptoms. So you can see this is a very broad range, and our job is to figure out which of these, if any, actually are demonstrable under controlled conditions. Next slide. So there is a need for controlled studies to find out what the effects are on mood or subjective state or behavior. So that even apart from subjective states, you can have behavioral effects that people might not even be aware of. We can ask who benefits. Is it a benefit only to a certain subset of people or to people who have psychiatric problems, or is it different in men and women? Although we need to understand more about the individual differences. We don't know exactly what doses or for how long you have to take it, and we don't know what the role of the expectancies is in the acute effects, in the effects of the drug. Next slide. So our studies that I'll be talking about here and that we do at the University of Chicago are conducted under double-blind and placebo-controlled conditions. So in these studies, usually in most of the studies, the same subjects get drug and placebo and drugs on different sessions. They don't know what they're getting on a particular session. And our version of double blind is also unique in that we don't even tell them what category of drug they're going to get. We tell them you might get a stimulant, a tranquilizer, a sedative, a hallucinogen, alcohol, and antihistamine. So we give quite a long list of possible drugs. So they really don't come in with expectations of getting a particular drug. And it so happens that our lab also does studies with other drugs. So this double-blind technique basically can control for their expectancies. We use, the participants are healthy men and women. They're aged 18 to 35. They have to have used a psychedelic drug at least once in their lifetime. And there's nothing really medical or ethical about this. This was just an abundance of caution on our part. They have to be normal body weight and have high school education, not be taking any medications. We administer the drug in the laboratory in a comfortable living room-like environment, and typically people stay in the lab for between 4 and 8 hours. So next slide, please. So the first study we did quite a number of years ago now was to kind of get an idea of what dose we could give and what dose produced these kind of marginal effects. So we're looking for sort of threshold effects that are ideally just below detectable, but maybe around the range of detectable. So the first study was to look at these different doses. So we had healthy men and women using a within subject design. So that means the same subjects got each of these 4 conditions: placebo, 6.5 micrograms, LSD, 13 and 26 micrograms. And in this very first session, we actually did keep the subjects in the lab for 8 hours. Because we didn't know what the duration of effect was. Nobody had done this in the past, and the drugs were given in mixed order and under double-blind conditions. Next slide. The first challenge, though, was to figure out what should we measure. There are so many claims of what these low doses do, and we didn't know exactly what outcome measures to look for. Then it's also very difficult to measure effects that are just threshold, so just marginally active. So if you're if you're too far below the threshold, then you see no effects. And then as a scientist, you think, well, maybe you just didn't give enough drug. And it's not that the drug doesn't do anything, you didn't give enough. And then if you're far over, then it's detectable, and that leads it to its own complications. The other problem with measuring threshold effects is that people differ a lot in their sensitivity to the drug. So for one person, the 13 micrograms might do nothing, and for another person, that might already be quite a strong effect. So there are many challenges to studying kind of threshold doses like this. So as a starting point, one of the measures that we used as a global measure, just ask people, do you feel any effect at all? So there we're not saying is it good or bad or what the quality of it, just do you feel anything? And this is a measure that we use with all kinds of other drugs so that we can compare this drug to other drugs. And then the other questionnaire that we use is something called the 5-dimension altered states of consciousness questionnaire. It's kind of a mouthful. And this is something that has been developed specifically to look at altered states of consciousness, either with psychedelic drugs or with other kinds of rituals that might produce maybe food deprivation or sleep deprivation or other religious experiences. So this is a kind of a general scale that's used for altered states of consciousness. So we thought we would use that as well. Next slide. So this is the first question, do you feel a drug effect? And on the left is a graph with data that we did not collect, it's in the published literature, with high doses of LSD. So on the x-axis, you see the time after administration. This is using doses of 100 and 200 micrograms of LSD. So time, they run up to 8 hours here. And then the y-axis is, do you feel any drug effect? So you can see that 100 and 200 produce near maximal effects. So they are reporting feeling a lot of effects. And so by comparison over on the right, you can see our data with these 3 doses that we tested, 6.5, 13, and 26. You can see that 6.5 is probably, it's really not that different. This is over 360 minutes after administration of the drug. The placebo is the lightest line at the bottom, and then they progressively get darker as the dose increases. And you can see the 26 microgram dose, it's still not even 50% of the maximal of the scale. So somewhere between the 13 and 26 is probably where we would want to be with microdoses to test them in the lab. Next slide, please. So then this questionnaire of the altered states of consciousness. So what is it? So it has, I'm just illustrating 3 of the scales here, and these are some of the questions that people have to answer. I felt one with my surroundings. I experienced a touch of eternity. I felt connected to a higher power, felt a sense of awe. So these are clearly subjective experiences. We're not used to measuring these kinds of experiences on a sort of quantitative basis with other drugs. But we go ahead and use it. This has been standardized and used in a number of other studies, so it's useful to compare. I would also say my background is in animal research, and so I like to do studies that kind of look at parallel behaviors in laboratory animals and in humans. But you can see that these states would be impossible to test in animal measures. So we have no idea what the counterpart of these kinds of altered states would be in rodent models, just as an aside. Anyway, this is a questionnaire that's thought to be sensitive. So next slide, please. And indeed, we found that those 4 scales of the altered states of consciousness, and that it's the super scale is called oceanic boundlessness. Again, unusual, doesn't sound scientific, but we're getting quantitative measures from it. So these are ratings, and just to put this in context, the scale goes up to 100 on the y-axis, and I'm showing you only up to 20 here. So I'm showing you very subtle effects. On the first set of 4 bars, the black bar corresponds to the placebo session, and then you have the 6.5, the 13, and the 26 micrograms. So you can see that there's a dose-related increase in reports of these experiences, even at these very low doses. Now, variability. So that means that some people are reporting nothing at 26 and other people are reporting something at 26. But if you put everybody together, I think this was, I can't remember exactly how many people, probably 30 people, something like that. So these are mean data for everybody. All right, so we're seeing just detectable effects. So Okay, I'm changing gears now and I'm going to tell you about 4 studies. So here's study number 2. So we first of all just did this dose response assessment to see what dose to give. The next study was we wanted to know whether LSD would change a physiological measure. It's sort of a behavioral and physiological measure. That is the brain's response to reward or upcoming reward. And this is a monetary reward. So they're playing a game where they can either win or lose money. It turns out there's a EEG brain reward signal called RUP. It's measured with EEG, and we use the monetary incentive delay task to measure it. Now, it turns out that people who have depression exhibit a smaller RUP. So people with depression have a smaller brain response to a signal that says they're either about to get a reward or receiving a reward. So they're less sensitive to rewards. So we asked the question whether LSD increases this reward signal. So if it really has all these beneficial effects on behavior, maybe it does it by just improving the brain's reactivity to rewards, even without any subjective effects. So the next slide shows you the results of this study. So this is the evoked potential response. The x-axis shows you the time in milliseconds after a signal that says there's an upcoming or a received reward. And then the y-axis tells you the magnitude of the electrical response in the brain. The solid line there corresponds to the placebo session. So you can see the brain sort of bumps up a little bit and then goes down after it gets a signal that there's an upcoming reward. And both of the doses, we gave 13 and 26 micrograms of LSD. And both of these doses indeed increased people's responses to reward. So this is kind of a positive signal that there might be something that the drug is doing to make good things better. And then that might have these very general effects that we see with microdosing. So that was the brain response. And of course, now we don't know whether this would change over repeated doses, and we don't know whether it would be different in different kinds of participants. These are all healthy volunteers. Next slide, please. So just to summarize that, I just said that it increased the neural response to signal for reward, but in this case, it was not clearly related to the subjective effects. So some people reported some subjective effects, but those were not clearly related to this increased neural response. Next slide. So then the next question we looked at was, the people who microdose in the natural situation don't just take the drug once, they take the drug repeatedly every 3 or 4 days. So there was a possibility that some new effects might emerge if you give the drug repeatedly that we hadn't seen with a single dose, or there might be either an increase in responses or there might be a decrease in responses. So it's very important to do this more kind of paralleling what gets done in the natural setting. So we got healthy volunteers and randomly assigned them to either a placebo group, a 13 microgram group, or a 26 microgram group. And they came in for 4 sessions, separated by 3 or 4 days each, and where they got the dose and stayed in the lab for some number of hours. So they participated in the 4, and then there was a post-test to see whether there were, with no drug, to see if there were any lasting effects. So one group got, I just said that, one group got placebo all times, and then 13 group and 26 microgram group. Next slide. So these 2 figures, these are 2 measures showing you the responses to the drug across those repeated sessions. And if you just look over on the left for the one that's labeled depression, so this is self-reported depression. And what we've plotted here is the change in their depression scores from before taking the drug at the beginning of the session to the highest point that they got in that session. So you can see, and it's separated by session 1, session 2, session 3, and session 4. So you can see if you just look at session 1 and you compare the placebo bar as the open bar, and then you have 13 and 26, there's a decrease in depression after the higher dose of the 26 micrograms of LSD. It's consistent with what people might claim. But you can see over the course of the sessions 2, 3, 4 that effect essentially disappears. So there's very rapid tolerance. So there's less of a reactivity that you see this effect on the first occasion, but not on the second, third, and fourth. And similarly, over on the right, it's people's self-reported vigor. You can see, first of all, if you look at session 1, you can see that their vigor declines if they sit in the lab and get placebo for 4 hours or 6 hours, whatever it was. So they get kind of just tired sitting in the lab. But the LSD, the higher dose of LSD especially, increases self-reported feelings of energy and vigor. This is measured with the profile of mood states. You can see it lasts across the sessions 2 and 3, but again, by session 4, there's very little of an little increase. So we can conclude from this that we saw no new effects emerge across the 4 doses. We did see whatever effects we saw on session 1 dissipated or declined across the 4 sessions, and nothing was different. We had a whole range of measures of emotionality and cognition and creativity, and nothing really changed either acutely after a single dose or after repeated doses on all these other measures. So we didn't see very much in except for this increased in energy and vigor with the repeated doses. And next slide. Just to summarize, I'm saying this: single doses increased ratings of vigor, decreased depression, and I just said that already. Okay, now to the 4th study and last one. We then worried that maybe we were looking at the wrong people. So we were looking at healthy volunteers, and maybe the people who are microdosing in the natural world are people who have depressed mood to begin with, or some problem or issue to begin with. So we decided to look at a single dose of LSD in people with depressed mood. So we recruited healthy volunteers who had low scores on the Beck Depression Inventory, and then volunteers who had mild depressed mood on this standardized measure of depression. These are not people who meet criteria, diagnosed psychiatric criteria for depression. They're just scoring higher than average. So we had 2 groups, the healthy volunteers and the depressed mood, and they had 2 sessions, 26 micrograms of LSD and placebo. Next slide, sorry. Here's the ratings of how much do you feel the drug effect. So you can see over the x-axis again is time. The y-axis is ratings of field drug. And this shows you the high BDI group and the low BDI group. And you can see that compared to placebo, both groups are reporting similar levels of field drug. So there's no difference in how much they feel the drug effect. But then next slide. This is plotted a little bit differently. Now I've plotted the green ones here are the low BDI group, and the purple ones are the high BDI group. I've shown you the scores before they get the drug and after the drug on the placebo session and the LSD session. So you can see for the low BDI group, that is the green lines, not much change in positive mood here after the drug or after placebo. On the high BDI group, the first thing to notice is that their positive mood scores are lower before getting any drug. On both days, they're lower than they were than the low BDI group. And you can see that the LSD actually markedly increased ratings of positive mood in the high BDI group and not in the low BDI group. So this is our first indication that the effects of LSD might depend on the pre-existing mood or physiological state or psychiatric state of the participant. So I think it's kind of exciting. I don't think anyone else has reported anything like this comparing healthy people to people with depression. Next slide. Then, surprisingly, when we also had these people complete this 5D AS, the altered states of consciousness, here again, the green bars correspond to the low BDI group, and the purple ones are the high BDI group. The stripy bars are the placebo, and the solid bars are drug. And you can see quite clearly that the effects of the drug on these measures is much greater in the high BDI group than in the low BDI group. So somehow the high BDI group is experiencing or reporting much greater psychedelic effects of the drug after administration of this single dose. Why this should be, we have no idea, but it's kind of seemed to be kind of across a lot of different measures, except field drug. So we saw that they were matched on field drug, so they all felt something, but these people, the high BDI group, are reporting more positive effects and then more psychedelic effects. And finally, the last slide, I think, of data is we also measured this depression scores 48 hours after the session. And you can see, first of all, you can see in the green compared to the blue, you can see that there wasn't much change in the low BDI because they didn't have very high scores to begin with. But in the high BDI group, there was a decrease in depression after the placebo session, but an even greater decrease in depression after the LSD session. So this is suggesting that the effects of the LSD might last 48 hours. Next slide. That's it for data. The summary here is just compared to controls. Participants with symptoms of depression reported greater acute effects, that is on positive mood, greater psychedelic effects, and then lower BDI scores 48 hours later. Next slide. Overall summary, low doses of LSD produced mild stimulant-like effects that decline with repeated doses. There was no effect on creativity, performance. There's a possible increase in brain response to reward, and there's possible differential effects in depressed individuals. Next slide. Lots of questions remain, and I think the other two speakers will address some of these. Have we measured the right things? Are there other ways to measure the apparent beneficial effects? Who benefits most from microdosing? How long do you have to use it? And what is the role of expectancies? Next slide. More questions. What are the neural mechanisms that underlie these effects? And are the effects of very low doses related in some way to the effects of very high doses? So we know that high doses also have beneficial effects. And are these similar effects at a lower dose, or are they something different? And is there any promise of microdoses as a medication? Next slide is the end, I think. Acknowledgements. These are some of the people who helped with these studies. They're postdoctoral fellows and a couple of colleagues and collaborators, and it was funded in part by our Institute for Translational Medicine. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Harriet. That super data, really, really nice. I can see some questions. No, that's really interesting. I want to ask you a couple of things. So your high BDI
Yes.
participants. Were they on any medication? Were they on
No.
Antidepressants? No.
Not at all. No.
Amplification. It's fantastic. I know that your numbers are relatively small, but do you see any sex differences, men versus women?
We do not.
No.
None. We have equal numbers of men and women. We have not seen any sex differences.
And there haven't been any studies in people mildly depressed, people with high-ish scores before?
Not to my knowledge.
No, I don't think that's really, really interesting.
Especially not comparing healthy volunteers to people who are symptomatic. I think there have been a number of studies in symptomatic people. They give a high dose of psilocybin and see whether it improves it, but not really comparing the effects of the drug in healthy acute effects. Yep.
And that increase in the effect that they got, not just on mood, but all the, the feeling of the drug is really interesting. That's what I think maybe, maybe they're on an SSRI. Okay, so I've got some questions, and I'm going to start with the last one. The decrease in BDI scores lasts for 48 hours. Okay, yeah, that's a really good question. Do you know, well, you said there probably aren't any other studies on this, but you never looked beyond 48 hours to see whether that would last?
We didn't, and I can just explain in part why we didn't. Don't forget, this was a within subject design. So they get one condition on one day, and then a week later they get the other condition. So, we could have asked before the second session, I suppose, and a week after that. We are now hoping to extend this to people with more severe depression, and we might look a little bit longer after the sessions.
Because you can imagine that for some patients with depression, it would be much more appealing to have some low doses for longer rather than high dose.
That's right. And this would support, this also sort of, I don't know how long it lasts really, but it supports the idea that they take it every 3 or 4 days. And if the antidepressant effect really lasts 48 hours or in that ballpark, then that sort of makes sense.
And somebody's asking what BDI means. I think that's the Beck Depression Inventory, is it?
Exactly. It's a standardized measure of measuring people's depressed mood and other somatic symptoms of depression.
So Cliff is saying that he sees a lot of people using low-dose ketamine a couple of times a week, about 0.1 of a gram. Could that be, I don't know, Cliff, if they are depressed people, but could be considered as self-medicating, could it, do you think?
Ketamine acts by a very different brain mechanism. And so I don't think I don't have anything substantive to say about that. People try a lot of different things, and if they believe in them, they work. And it's not to say that it doesn't work. It's conceivable, but I haven't heard anybody doing any studies on that. So, people try a lot of things that turns out there's not much of an effect there.
Cliff is saying that most of them have high anxiety and medium levels of depression.
I see. Okay. Yeah. Well, it's an open area. It's for someone to study.
Yeah. I think that's really interesting. And he's also asking about ADHD, if there's any evidence for, I don't think so, but you're the expert, for microdosing working for ADHD. David, you've put your screen on. Have you got anything to say? Oh, or you just click something by accident?
No, I think that the comment about ketamine, I think, to be honest, that dose, as my best estimate, is actually a proper ketamine dose. And I think that is probably more in the context of what's happening with treatment-resistant depression treatment with licensed Spravato S-ketamine. And people know that is a licensed medicine. So some people self-medicate depression, anxiety with ketamine. But I think 100 milligram, I think, is actually a proper oral dose of ketamine. So that's not it's not very similar to what we are talking about here. Microdosing is probably a bit more similar to what people are using clinically more and more now for depression. So that sounds like self-medication, medicating. ADHD, our Maastricht colleagues are just completing a trial with LSD microdosing in ADHD, and I don't know what we're allowed to reveal. I've only heard it from a colleague who just met them last week at a conference. So I don't know how official it is, but it is being studied and it's on its way out.
The data are coming out?
Yeah.
Okay, so
when it's coming out, but I think they just completed collecting the data, and
so maybe
underwhelming results.
Sorry, what did you say?
Slightly underwhelming results.
Underwhelming. Okay, well,
as I heard, this is rumor based, but it sounds like they don't see much of an effect apparently.
okay.
But I
won't quote you on that.
Oh no,
Don't worry.
that it's recorded. I'm gonna be slaughtered, but
Yeah, when it comes out, it's hugely positive. But Cliff,
that'll be a positive surprise. Yeah,
yeah, be a surprise for everyone. Hopefully that helps, Cliff, because when giving talks and things, we have met people who microdosing for bipolar, for all sorts of different disorders, actually. So that, but it's very important to see the evidence for this. So it'd be great to see that study. And Maastricht, is that Kim Cooper's? So that will come out soon. So, okay, so McGregor has an interesting point here. This might be for all of you, actually. Imagine the same study run on low-dose caffeine or low-dose alcohol. He seems to think that captures the limitations of the study. The benefits of coffee are so much more than the drug, it's the process, the routine, the social aspects. I don't know. Could the same be said for microdosing? I wouldn't have thought so. Oh, maybe it's a routine, part of your day. I don't know. What do you think about that?
There are sort of two separate questions. One is, to what extent does the pharmacology of the drug contribute to the outcome? And the other is, does this combination of drug and ritual and expectations work? And if you're just interested in the latter, then it doesn't matter what the expectations are. It doesn't matter what the psychotherapy are. You're just interested in combine the drug with the psychotherapy, and you combine the coffee drinking and smell on ritual, and you feel better. So for some purposes, it doesn't matter if the drug isn't particularly active. But for my purpose, that's the question I'm asking: is to what extent does the drug itself contribute to the effect? And so you could ask the same question of the caffeine. You could do all the rituals and believe in it, and people have done this with. In fact, Roland Griffiths did a lot of studies with caffeine under double-blind conditions, and he had them go through all their rituals and do it for a whole month, and he manipulated the amount of actual caffeine in there. So people have studied that and can study it under controlled conditions.
Yeah, really interesting. Absolutely. Okay, now this This is really a question for everybody, I think. But Harriet, did anybody report negative effects, side effects, the people in your studies?
No, nobody did. We're talking low doses here.
Yeah.
So the worst that you get, or if it's worst, you get a little bit of visual distortion sometimes. You know, people experience things, feel that things are a little bit different somehow, but we had no adverse effects at these low doses.
That's really, really good to hear, actually. Brilliant. Okay. Yeah, no more questions for now. Thank you, Harriet.
Thank you.
Fascinating. And the EEG, just sorry before we...
Yes.
I thought the EEG data were really impressive.
Yeah, we'll have to see whether it holds up with replication and maybe in depressed people and maybe with repeated doses. There's enough work here to keep 10 people busy for the next decade. So
there sure is. There sure is. And McGregor says he thanks you for your answer. Totally agrees this is a very good study of pharmacological effects.
thank you. Thank
That's
you,
lovely.
McGregor.
Thank you. Thank you, McGregor. That's just lovely. And it absolutely is. Yeah, it's a brilliant study. Okay, thank you very much, Harriet.
All right, thank you. Thanks.
Brilliant. So we'll move on to our next presenter, Kate Godfrey. Hello, Kate. And for people, if it wasn't for Kate, we wouldn't have the tech working today. So I'm very glad you're here for many reasons. So Kate's a postdoc and she's at Imperial now. So the Imperial Centre for Psychedelic Research, which is where David Erritzoe is as well. I'm guessing they work together. She has a background in neuroscience and pharmacology, and her research is currently focused on the mechanisms of psychedelic drugs using imaging techniques. And we've such sophisticated neuroimaging now. It's brilliant. So she did her degree in New Zealand and worked on a phase 1 LSD trial conducted at the University of Auckland. And she will be talking about that today. And that study was with Suresh Muthukumaraswamy. And he was on our podcast, the Drug Science Podcast, folks. So that's a really good listen. Hannah and I talked to Suresh. That was a real pleasure, actually. So that is another of our podcasts on microdoses. Kate, really warm welcome.
Thank you for the introduction. Indeed, I do now. So I'm now based in London, working with the Imperial group. But before that, I did my PhD at the University of Auckland. Suresh was my PhD supervisor. And after I submitted my PhD, I worked for a year in that lab, working on this randomized control trial of LSD microdosing. Massive credit to all the co-authors here on the screen. It definitely wasn't solely my project. Robin Murphy was a PhD student on the project, and it was really a team effort achieving this ambitious project. So I'm going to run through quickly today a couple of the sort of key findings from the study, and then some of the sort of next steps that are happening back in the Auckland lab. While I'm no longer sort of with them directly, I still keep in touch. And so there's some exciting studies that they're doing currently. So for this study, the rationale, I'll sort of briefly set the scene of the rationale of why the study was done. And so there are a few reasons. One of them was Suresh was sort of starting out a line of psychedelic research in New Zealand. There hadn't really been any psychedelic studies previously. Microdosing felt like a kind of a nice baby step to jump into the world of psychedelic research without sort of as much potential red tape, although I think there was still quite a lot. Also, there was the uniqueness with the New Zealand legislation, which I can talk about a little bit in a little bit, but basically that meant that we could have participants dosed at home. And so as Harriet was mentioning with her studies, the participants have to come into the lab to receive the substance because these are controlled substances that can't be taken home typically. But in New Zealand, there was sort of a loophole, I guess, in our sense, in the law that allowed us to prescribe these drugs and allow people to take them in their own home settings. And that's a bit more sort of naturalistic. And we'll sort of talk about some of the results that sort of came from that, comparing these doses taken in a lab setting versus doses taken in a home setting. There's also sort of a clinical need for more treatments for mood disorders, particularly, and before sort of embarking on a line of work with depression, the natural first step was to, as Harriet sort of did as well, tests to see, is this feasible in healthy individuals? What are sort of the side effect profiles, I guess, or the effects of this dose, to test the feasibility of it before moving on into a clinical population. And as Harriet mentioned as well, there's a large sort of grey literature. That's sort of what we call these sorts of more books or anecdotal reports about this phenomenon, and people reporting that it was really helpful, and sort of there's this need to now sort of test this and see, is there something here? Is there some signal for something to be actually beneficial, or maybe is it a placebo effect, which is a big sort of question at the moment. The study design, there were 2 arms. It was a placebo-controlled, blinded study. There was a placebo group, which was just saline placebo, so not an active placebo, and then an LSD group. And there were 40 participants at each group, so a total of 80 participants. And as I mentioned, it was double-blind. We didn't know what they were getting. They didn't know what they were getting. Like I mentioned, in New Zealand, so these Class A drugs can be supplied for a period of 4 weeks per prescription. So we were able to send them away with sort of 4 weeks worth of microdoses. They'd come back and get a few. I think we sent them with slightly less than that. They had a couple of resupply visits, and it was a 6-week dosing period. The exact dosing protocol was kind of based on the grey literature that was available at the time. And typically people were reporting that they would dose for about 6 weeks. Dosing every 3rd day was sort of what was recommended, based on a few sort of books reporting sort of recommendations. And then the dose chosen was 10 micrograms of LSD, which was again sort of consistent with that 1/10 of a recreational dose. But yeah, there wasn't a lot to go off when designing this. It was sort of just a first pass based on what sort of was being done naturalistically. It was a sublingual administration. You can see there that is one of the doses in a sort of small syringe. So it was squirted underneath the tongue, sat in the mouth for 30 seconds, and then swallowed. When they were dosing at home, we did need to check the sort of compliance with the protocol, I guess, and making sure they didn't go home and immediately take all the doses at once. Not that would particularly do a lot, because they were, I think, only ever given sort of 5 doses at once. But we did mobile direct observed therapy. It was when basically in the morning they'd have to film themselves taking the dose and then submit it online. So they got a text on their dosing days with a link to follow, and they could upload the video of them taking the dose. And we would then check that that video was indeed collected on that day and that they did it properly, just to make sure that everybody was sort of following the protocol. And in terms of on those days where they were dosed at home, we told them not to engage in dangerous activities for 6 hours. We were asking them not to drive in that window. I guess people working an 8-hour day, they could drive to work, take the dose at work, and then drive home at the end of the day. And there was some sort of inclusion criteria around people who had dangerous jobs, just in sort of an abundance of caution. If they were operating heavy machinery, they were typically not eligible to take part, just in case, because we weren't sure. This is the sort of study design. I'll go through it quite quickly. There were a lot of measures collected at a lot of time points. But we had a baseline visit, and that was, we sort of have a baseline week, and people would come in. We would do EEG. I won't be talking about that today, but we have a paper recently out about that. And then there's some cognitive tasks, creativity tasks, emotional battery, and questionnaires. It kind of plays into what Harriet was talking about, where we're not really sure what to measure here. There are so many reported benefits. So we tried to be sort of as diverse as possible with the measures taken, while not being too intense for the participants. We didn't want to overburden them, but there was sort of a range of measures administered. Then that end of that baseline day, they would start evening surveys, and also wearing a Fitbit. So they wore a Fitbit for the duration of the study, like a wearable watch, so we could track their activity and sleep. And then also every evening for the whole duration of the study, they were sent a small survey, and I'll show you what that looks like in a few slides, just asking them about their day that day and a few different VAS scales. A week later, they'd come in for their first dose, which was given in the lab. This was just to check to make sure that it was tolerable before we send them home to take the rest of them, and also to collect some like acute measures during a dose, while the rest of them are then done from home. We did blood sampling to check the sort of pharmacodynamics of the drug, and vitals and heart rate to check the sort of physiological safety. And then again, we did EEGs, creativity tasks, cognitive tasks, and questionnaires about the sort of experience. After that, they went home with some doses and started the home dosing. That was over a period of 6 weeks, like I mentioned, and they had resupply visits during that time where they'd come back in just to grab sort of their next batch of dose and then go back home again. Finally, they had a final visit, which was 2 days after their last dose. We repeated sort of all the measures that we do at these in-person visits, like the EEG, the cognitive testing, creativity, etc. And that was on a non-dose day. So they hadn't had a microdose that day, but it was to test for sort of persisting benefits. So people would sort of in the literature saying that these are sort of persisting benefits, like cumulative benefits, I guess, where at the end of a 6-week period, you would then feel more creative after that time. So it was to test, are these benefits strictly on the dosing days, or is there some sort of lasting benefit after you've taken so many doses that sort of persist? For safety-wise, looking at the blood pressure and heart rate, it was very sort of safe. The only significant thing was the heart rate, and it was driven by actually a reduction in the placebo group and not an increase in the LSD group. So while there may be something there, it doesn't seem to elevate the heart rate. It might prevent a decrease in heart rate as they sort of get a bit bored over the day. But yeah, there was no real sort of safety concerns, blood pressure or heart rate wise. And then in terms of the adverse events from when they were dosing at home, we were quite liberal in our collecting of adverse events. We sort of said, regardless if you think it's associated with the drug or not, tell us. And obviously over a 6-week period, people are going to have a few headaches. They're going to have a few tummy aches. But overall, it appeared quite safe, and the adverse events were quite well matched between the placebo and the active groups. We had no serious adverse events, and one adverse event of note that was sort of overrepresented in the LSD group compared to the placebo group is this like feeling jittery, which I'm not sure if that's a term used outside of New Zealand. It may be kind of New Zealand specific, but it kind of indexes a bit of overstimulation potentially, or feeling a bit on edge, a bit sort of I think overstimulation is probably the best way to describe it. And we did have quite a few reports of that within the LSD group. In terms of tolerability, kind of leading on from that, generally the doses were well tolerated, but this overstimulation effect was actually sort of quite noticeable. We added in sort of more measures of jitteriness after the first sort of batch of participants because it was quite common. And in the end, 7 participants actually had to be titrated down to reduce their dose over the dosing period because of this overstimulation effect. 3 participants then actually discontinued dosing as well. So it did, while it didn't cause any serious adverse events, for some people this overstimulation was sort of intolerable, especially combined with having to go to work, having to sort of engage in everyday activities while you're overstimulated can be a little bit overwhelming. So potentially for those people, upon reflection, we thought that earlier tapering of the dose may have prevented those dropouts. And it was sort of a learning of the study. And as Harriet mentioned, like there's a large variability, and this 10 micrograms can be quite a lot for some people where they really definitely feel it, and then some other people were convinced they were on placebo and completely like didn't report anything really in terms of perceived effects. So I think there is a variability there between individuals, and the sort of personalization of the dose and adjusting it is kind of an important lesson that will be taken forward to like future studies. In total, there were actually 4 people that dropped out of the active group. So that's a 10% dropout rate is actually quite substantial, and is definitely something to be considered going forward into the sort of clinical trials. But in these cases of the sort of dropout, all the anxiety that was sort of reported did subside within 2 weeks, and there was sort of no lingering effects. So we were still sort of satisfied with that. The feasibility, another thing we wanted to test was, is it discernible? Like, is this well blinded with a saline placebo? Is that enough to kind of trick people, or do people know their allocation or do they not? And the blinding was effective in the placebo group. So you can see on this figure, the gray sort of window means that there's an uncertainty about which dose they're in. It's slightly towards the sort of placebo, but they were indeed in that sort of acceptable threshold. So that placebo group weren't sure. The LSD group did like break blind. So they were sort of able to accurately sort of guess that they were in the LSD group. This indicates a need for potentially future studies to have an active placebo, or like more deception, like Harriet was talking about, where they're not even sure what dose what drug they're getting, let alone if it's going to be a placebo. So another good learning going forward. But the adherence to the protocol was good. The remote monitoring was good. We had sort of very good participants, and we were happy with that. And these experiences of anxiety seem to be kind of related to stressful life events. So either sort of family things going on or workplace things. And that's something to also sort of take forward into the next studies, especially if there's a population with higher baseline anxiety. Okay. So this is the questionnaire that I mentioned that was done at the end of every day during the whole dosing sort of period, where at the end of the day they were given a text with these sorts of questions, and it was just, how well did you feel today? How happy did you feel today? Stress, etc. And also they could report if anything unpleasant happened that day, and that's where we got the sort of adverse events from. They also each day had to guess which dose they got on a dosing day. So this is for the other days. And then when we analyze these, and so we see here on each of these figures, we can see that we have this here is on the dosing day itself. This is on the day after dosing day, and this is 2 days after the dosing day for each of these domains. And we can see, for example, energy here in the dosing day was significantly higher in the LSD group compared to placebo. So there were a couple of these domains that showed sort of a significant difference between the LSD group and the placebo group. This was quite interesting. It did sort of show that on the day, potentially these effects aren't just placebo effects that are happening here. There does seem to be some benefit on the day of the LSD compared to the placebo. The ones in green there are the ones that are significant. And then to test if this was sort of a result of blinding or not, we got only the doses that they said they weren't sure which allocation they got. So all the ones that they were pretty sure they had LSD were thrown out. And if you just take the people that weren't really sure of their allocation, energy and wellness still remain significant. So this is quite promising and indicating that there is something potentially happening here on the dosing days that is sort of beyond that of a placebo effect potentially, and might be worth sort of pursuing, especially in a group where we want to increase energy or increase well-being as a therapeutic mechanism. This is showing the effect size estimates for a couple of these domains, with the red being the dose that was given in the lab, with sort of the variability of that effect, and then the black being all the subsequent doses. And what we can see for quite a few is actually, for example, irritability on the day in the lab wasn't sort of changing too much. But then we look, once they go home, they take it in their own environment, the effect sizes seem to be quite a lot bigger. So they were less irritable, potentially more creative, the more energy, more connected. This kind of plays into that perhaps dosing in a lab environment where you're having to do sort of behavioral tasks and have an EEG done isn't the best environment for you to be expressing your creativity or feeling energetic or feeling happy. Potentially, this is sort of an advantage of being able to dose at home and showing that the sort of setting might play a role in these effects. We also noticed that after about the sort of the third dose, quite a few of them kind of taper off a little bit. This is also interesting and could potentially feed into future designs where maybe you just need to take sort of a few doses and then have a break, and then a few more doses and then have a break, which could be an interesting thing to sort of explore in the future, as there seems to be some sort of wearing off of this effect, I guess, or sort of a habituation effect potentially. Finally, another sort of data slide about sleep. So this is using the Fitbit data that we collected. So they were wearing a Fitbit for the duration of the study, and that allowed us to track their sleep, including the sort of time spent in light sleep, deep sleep, REM sleep. And what we see, the total sleep, for the clearest picture here, we actually see on the day after their dosing day, the LSD group had significantly longer sleeps compared to the placebo group. This is quite interesting. Pharmacologically, I guess it could indicate some sort of withdrawal, the serotonin withdrawal effect, or the fact that it is the day after is quite interesting. And it sort of persists across multiple domains. So there's an increase in REM sleep, the deep sleep is higher, the light sleep is a bit higher. And so, yeah, this was sort of an interesting, unexpected finding. Now I'm going to report the null results. We'll bring everyone back down to earth a little bit. This was in the pre-post measures. So like I mentioned, we collected baseline, and then on that last day, which was not a microdosing day, to check for the cumulative effect of microdosing. So does 6 weeks of microdosing make you more creative when you're not on a dose? And overall, these were sort of overwhelmingly negative. So personality, like trait measures like personality, there was no change in personality over the sort of dosing period, obviously placebo controlled here. The mood measures, their depression and their anxiety, the cognitive task performance like working memory or dimension shifting, emotional measures like anger and their life satisfaction, and also creativity tasks. So we did a range of creativity tasks. This creativity paper will be coming out soon. Kind of goes into that a little bit more. One of them was the cat, that's a picture of one of them, which is sort of one of our favorites. Of they were given 15 minutes to create something using colored paper that embodied silliness. And that was what one of the participants selected to create. But yeah, so in this population, we didn't seem to see any major differences between before and after 6 weeks of microdosing. But this was a healthy population, and there could be ceiling effects in a lot of these domains. The depression and anxiety weren't very high to start with, and they were sort of all quite high on working memory, life satisfaction. The creativity is quite interesting because that is one of the proposed benefits from for healthy people to microdose. We didn't seem to see anything like that. And the creativity for those creativity tests was also not increased on the dosing day either. The feelings of creativity were, so people reported feeling more creative, but the actual objective measures of creativity didn't seem to show anything. Whether that's our battery of creativity tasks don't really capture the type of creativity that this is eliciting, that's another question. But overall, the creativity sort of looked like there wasn't a lot of signal there for it to actually be beneficial in a healthy population. But these are not deterring things to sort of move on into testing in a potential clinical population, especially with the evidence that Harriet also provided of potentially these effects being a little bit larger in these populations, or that have more scope for change in a lot of these measures. So overall take homes, we found some evidence of improved mood and well-being on the dosing days, but not any significant effects sort of for long-term effects in healthy people. Like I mentioned, this could be a ceiling effect, or it could also, maybe these microdoses could be combined with something like mindfulness to sort of boost the efficacy in healthy people, but that's to be determined. There is potentially some potential for clinical application given the improved mood on the dosing days, with the sort of take homes being we need to improve the blinding for the next study, maybe have more purposeful dosing days. So having to take a microdose on a day that you know is going to be a stressful work day probably isn't going to be very beneficial. But if you can sort of purposely take them on weekends or days that are sort of more intentional, where you combine it with some sort of activity, maybe that is a good model moving forward. And also that we should titrate people as soon as overstimulation is reported in order to ensure that it's more tolerable and allow people to sort of continue the dosing block. The next studies that are going to be happening at the University of Auckland are already happening. So there's this MD Real study, and that's a collection and testing of community microdoses, as well as some sort of survey measures. It's entirely online, very anonymous sort of study, but taking people in New Zealand who are already microdosing, they're able to provide a sample to be tested so we can check what doses are people using in a naturalistic setting, and also what is the sort of differences in these outcome measures between people naturalistically doing it and what we're kind of seeing in our clinical studies. And also comparing to non-microdosing health controls. Then there's the depression line of work, so LSD-DEP. This is going to be sort of an 8-week, starting with an 8-week open label feasibility trial, testing this sort of similar protocol in depressed patients. They're going to be starting at 8 micrograms and titrating up or down, depending on how they find it. If they're sort of not reporting any effects, maybe they go up. If they're finding it too much, they can go down. And then also combining this with some therapeutic intervention and encouraging sort of intentional enriching the behavior on those days. And then that's followed by an optional 8-week open label extension for the people in the placebo group specifically. That will then lead into a larger RCT version. So once those sort of parameters are sort of established and the feasibility is tested from that first study, moving into a randomized control trial. Then there's also microdosing for sort of end-of-life anxiety, which is combining meaning-centered psychotherapy and microdosing for advanced stage cancer patients. So that's another really interesting study that's happening at the moment. It'll be interesting to see how that goes. The more sort of microdosing has traditionally been more away from that therapeutic model, but can these microdoses actually be combined with a therapeutic intervention, as is more typical for a high-dose study? And can we see some benefits from that? My acknowledgements, I want to massively thank these three specifically, Suresh and Robin Murphy, who's the PhD student who did a lot of the work on the trial, and then also Rachel Sumner, who's a postdoc in the group there, and all the other sort of co-authors and funders of the study. So, thank you.
Brilliant. Great. That's such a lot of work, Kate. That's a really big, extensive study.
Yeah, we also collected all the data from those 80 people in a year. So that was also quite an ambitious data collection while COVID was happening as well. So it was definitely a big effort, but it was a really fun study to work on. Very
fun
rewarding.
Study, yeah. And I mean, you did get effects, some really interesting effects. The effect on sleep was very interesting, I thought.
Yeah, definitely, and definitely very like when we spoke about with David Nutt, he had quite a few ideas about that. Somebody who's a bit better with pharmacology than I am specifically. But there is some sort of rationale of why that might actually be the case, and it might indeed be like a withdrawal from a sort of serotonergic medication kicking in. Not necessarily like a concerning withdrawal, but more just an increase in sleep quality.
Which would be a really beneficial effect for people.
Exactly, yeah, especially, a lot of disorders are characterized by disrupted sleep.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, and it's so hard to treat and to deal with. What do you make of the increase in stimulation, the jittery effects?
In what way do you mean?
Well, I mean, were you surprised by that? I'm surprised by that.
I'm not necessarily... No, as someone who's quite pharmacologically sensitive herself, and a cup of coffee is enough to get me kind of overstimulated, I'm not too surprised. I think it does definitely have a lot of inter-individual variability, like caffeine does. And I don't know, like the amount of coffee people drink, I could never. I would become completely unproductive because I would just be so overstimulated. So it doesn't surprise me too much, no.
And your participants, had they had experience with the psychedelic before?
So some of them had. It wasn't an inclusion criteria as it was for Harriet studies. So I think about 30% of them in each group were psychedelic naive, but a lot of them had. I think that we did have a criteria that they couldn't have recently had a psychedelic experience. I believe in the last. It's been a while since I did all those screenings. I think it was in the last year, maybe. They couldn't have taken a psychedelic drug in that time. A lot of them had like a lot of experience, maybe like 10 years ago, and then now they've sort of got kids and a job and are less frequently taking these substances.
Was the jitteriness related to whether they'd used it before?
I wouldn't say so, no. I think the one thing that I would relate that to when I think back on the people that were jittery is potentially like a higher level of baseline anxiety, or maybe, I mean, none of them had like previously diagnosed conditions, but those who were perhaps a little bit closer to the threshold were the ones potentially having a slightly harder time with the anxiety. It might be sort of personal susceptibility thing. Yeah.
It's not that unlike our reports of increased vigor and energy. So it's some people kind of reinterpret that, just like when we give amphetamines. For some people, increase in vigor is energizing and positive, and for other people it makes them a little bit nervous. So I think it's consistent with all of our findings with the increase in sort of stimulant-like effect.
Definitely. And also another thing to note was that none of them really reported feeling jittery on that first day in the lab. So when we were giving it in the lab, a lot of them were quite like underwhelmed, or sort of didn't really have too much to say in terms of overstimulation. It was more so a couple of doses later when they were having to dose while at work or in their activity, and then they kind of started to notice it and be like, oh, there's something different here.
Yeah, it's interesting that the effects seem to be more pronounced in the normal environment rather than in the lab environment.
Good. Well, I would think you feel very safe in the lab, probably, and supported.
Potentially, yeah. And then also just slightly understimulated, potentially. We were leaving them for periods of half an hour to an hour to just sort of relax, and while we waited to do various measures and whatnot. So it's potentially not as... it is a stressful environment. You've got a cannula, you've got people taking your blood. It's kind of a little bit stressful, but also kind of a boring day. So
yes, you're kind of stuck there all day.
Yeah.
Okay, I have a couple of questions. What was the exclusion criteria?
Yeah, so they were also healthy men. I don't think they put that on there. I did have a slide of inclusion criteria, but I took that out in the interest of time. But we did only include men. That was a combination of things. One being the EEG metrics. We've got somebody in the lab who is doing excellent work on menstrual cycle effects on the EEG measures that we use. In order to control for them, that was going to be potentially a little bit challenging. And then also regulatory pressure to not include females in this first pass, potentially playing a role as well. The next studies in the depression population will be both men and women. So we're moving away from doing just men. And then it was, no history of sort of prior psychiatric diagnosis, no, like the blood pressure, normal, sort of a BMI cutoff as well. They had to be over 25, actually. So I think it was 25 to 50. Oh God, it's been a while again. It's not in front of me, but most of them were sort of in their 30s or 40s. Was the sort of age range that a lot of them were.
Can you expand on the regulatory pressure? Well, I guess that was...
I didn't make this decision, so I can't talk about that. That's just from what I remember at that time. It was just...
So what time of day did people take their microdose?
It was around about 9 a.m. for some of them and 11 a.m. for others. So we had sort of staggered. We were doing multiple people per day, but it was in the morning that they were being dosed. When they then got to do it at home, they had to take the dose before 12 o'clock. So because people did have different sleep schedules or different working schedules, they had to take it by 12 o'clock. We did have some flexibility on if, for example, somebody was flying on one day or something like that, or they were like, this day is really not great for me, they could move it one day either side to accommodate that. But most of the time they took it on the dosing days allocated, and it was before 12 o'clock.
And I really like your idea of taking it a couple of days, maybe 3 or 4 doses, and then not again for a while. Especially
it's interesting.
Yeah. In your data, that might be a good way to do it.
Yeah, and I guess Harriet's as well, like sort of seeing that effect of each dose sort of taper off a little bit with each dose. And so maybe there is benefit in taking a break and then resuming after a while.
And the same person is asking why women weren't included. I think that's ethics, is it?
Yeah. It was a variety of reasons. I think we would have ideally liked to have had women, but like with the way that the study had to be run, and then it was just a complicated issue. But now the studies going forward will all be men and women.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, thank you very much, Kate. Brilliant. That's a fantastic study. Really,
thank you.
Really interesting results as well. So
massive credit to Robin Murphy as well, and she's also looking for a postdoc at the moment. So if anyone in the audience,
anyone out there,
postdoc is wonderful. They're great.
Good, lovely. Thank you very much. So we'll move on to our third presenter then. David Erritzoe, psychiatrist and in neuroscience. And he's looking like to be a sort of godfather of psychedelic research because he's been working on this since 2009. David, that's quite a long time. So he's working on clinical research and the effects, the brain mechanisms of psychedelics at Imperial, as you can see there in his first slide. He's a clinical senior lecturer in psychiatry in the Centre for Psychedelic Research, and he's a clinical director there. So we're very lucky to have David here with us. He's a very busy man. And he's also got an NHS-based psychedelic research clinic, CIPPRes, which is based at the St. Charles Hospital. So very warm welcome, David, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me. Yeah, I've even been working longer with psychedelics in 2004, I think.
Brilliant.
Yeah. So getting the granddad of no, but yeah. So I will be talking about so the main work that I'll be talking about is actually even a little bit older, but we have a new take on the overall evidence that will come in the end of the talk. And after these very sort of regular controlled lab-based study of lab in New Zealand, they were able to let people take the drugs at home. Then I'm stepping out into the sort of not as perfect science, but into the more naturalistic way of collecting data. Let me just start with a little sort of consideration generally about how psychedelics in general differs in terms of the testing compared to conventional pharmacology that we test. So in normal testing of new medications that are not psychedelics, it's only the drug being tested and the effect of it, and the investigators are in full control of doses and study design, and also you can typically have a control condition with a placebo, and therefore able to sort of blind people at least to some degree. That's the conventional way of doing trials. With psychedelics, with the full doses in particular, it's difficult. There's psychology therapy mixed into the model. The subjective experience is suddenly a thing because of the effects of these drugs. And it's, for that reason, very difficult to placebo control or blind the participants in these trials. And that's obviously mainly the issues for full doses, so proper psychedelic doses. And then also compared to conventional pharmacology, there's a much bigger interest and focus on the interaction with the environment. There's a lot of attention paid to the setting with the full doses. And then we have something very different. We have real world use. So normally, if you saw a pharma company presenting a new antidepressant, it's not that they would be able to test how is this medication, this compound being used out in the real world. But we have that privilege because of the history and the culture around psychedelics being drugs that are in nature and have been used in many different cultures throughout history. So in terms of the history of it, there were a lot of trials actually being conducted in the 1950s, 60s, in the first era of psychedelic science in the Western world, but there was not any microdosing done at that point. In this more new era, since the around millennium, with this re-emerge of the emergence of trials and science in psychedelics, it all started back in the labs, mainly Johns Hopkins and also at Imperial and Zurich and so on in the beginning. And they were doing sort of lab-based studies where they tried to investigate the effects of these compounds. However, microdosing is a little bit of a different history. I would say the focus and the science into microdosing doesn't come from the lab. It came from, because it's a recent phenomenon. It started sort of out in the real world, bits of a Silicon Valley kind of popular phenomenon some years back. And particularly after Fadiman published a book on the topic. And therefore, also the data collection started differently. It didn't start with controlled, as well as we can, trials, but more naturalistic data collection, anecdotes being collected, and so on. And then to the two talks, Kate and Harriet, where they actually overcome this issue in New Zealand by being able to give people the drugs at home, because otherwise it's very complicated and expensive and very unnatural to have people coming in multiple times to sit in a lab. That's not how you do a normal drug trial, and that is an issue with psychedelic microdosing because of the legal status of the drugs, and therefore complication in the regulatory aspects of doing such a trial. But therefore, it was great to see that they managed to do it in New Zealand, where they could actually let people take the drugs at home, because otherwise it becomes very expensive, very complicated, very inconvenient for people to have to come into a lab all the time for many weeks. So what is microdosing, and what do we know? Is it just full placebo? Is it actually homeopathy because the doses are so low? I guess it's already been addressed, because you have seen the previous presentations here with the doses and also that people feel it. So I think the only thing we can proper rule out is that it's not homeopathy. And one of the reasons is that we can see that the doses that people are using for microdosing, if we do brain imaging with PET scans, we can see how many of the receptors these doses of the psychedelic is actually hitting in the brain. And that we can see that around 40% of the receptors are actually affected of the psychedelic active receptor with the doses that people typically use for microdosing. And therefore, there is theoretical possibility that it could have some real pharmacological effect in the brain. That's a good start. So it's not homeopathy. It's not diluted down to a degree, the doses that people are using out in real life. But okay, the thing up to the right here, I think that's a very important and interesting thing to explore more in the future. It's also addressed a bit in the future in the two previous talks. This I will go very quickly through. The psychedelics mainly work by stimulating a specific receptor called the 2A receptor, the serotonin system. Different mechanism, but in the same system compared to SSRIs. And then here you see the same occupancy plot, where the microdosing levels are actually a real thing. As mentioned before, occupancy that up to more than 40% in the microdosing range. So therefore, such information about the pharmacology combined with the multiple anecdotes and books about the fantastic effects already show very same words listed here of fantastic positive effects reported in anecdotes and books and so on, that all together made it worth for us studying. And remember, this is in a way back to the start before these data were out that Harriet and Kate were talking about when we started planning our work. So therefore, we thought, obviously, we have to test it. We were already doing a lot of work with full dose psychedelics. We have to test microdosing as well, because there's good reasons that is worth studying. One little thing just to mention, because it has been mentioned before today, I think, that they also stimulate another receptor, 2B, another serotonin receptor, that there's not much of that in the brain, but there's a lot in the periphery and the cardiovascular system and heart valves, and there have been previous drugs that stimulate that specific receptor that were taken off the market because they led to fibrosis of the heart valves. So very long repeated use of a drug that stimulate that receptor, there's a question mark, and I think companies that are trying to do the gold rush and harvest the fruits of the popular phenomenon of psychedelics, if they are promoting microdosing or developing it, you would hope that they will also do conscientious work looking at the effects, for instance, in animal models of heart valve effects. And I have not seen anything really out there yet. How to study it? So we now go back to something more basic and more simple and also cheaper than the studies that Kate and Harriet were describing, which is doing it out in the real world. So sort of field work, but we can do it with online platforms, so we don't really need to even go out to the fields, but we can study what people are doing out in the real world, which is therefore called naturalistic kind of studies. And we have done a lot of that with different angles to use of psychedelics. And a couple of our studies have been specifically microdosing. Here, the two to the right. So I'll first speak about this one, and I'll do it very briefly because it's just not brilliant science, because there's no placebo. and it's naturalistic with all the different variations and limitations and unknowns there are when you do that. So when we do that, we basically let people sign up on the online survey. They can be anywhere in the world if they are planning to microdose on their own initiative using their own drug to microdose. Then we do some baseline assessments. That means before they start the planned regime of microdosing, and then we follow them in the period of 4 weeks while they do the microdosing, where we do different data collections online. And that's basically the super simple design. What we could see in the data was that most of the people had tried psychedelics before. Only 13% were psychedelic naive, which means they hadn't tried it before. And some of them had already tried microdosing. You can see that the drugs that were used the most were psilocybin and LSD. So here we don't have that control that you saw before in the trials presented because this is naturalistic. So people could microdose with a range of different things, but mainly people are using LSD 50% and 45% psilocybin, which is quite typical that those are the two that people are microdosing. And it depends a bit on what country, what is easiest to get access to, or what is most popular, what people talk about by the photocopier machine in the Google headquarters or wherever people are doing this. And people in this case, they took it typically 2 to 3 times per week, and around 9 microgram, which is quite equivalent to what was used in the New Zealand study that you just saw. So what then were the results in this naturalistic, prospective, non-placebo controlled trial? What we basically see is that well-being goes up. So that's called it's a WEMWEB, so it's a validated scale for psychological well-being, goes up. You see that the measure of depression, this one is QITS, which is a self-reported validated scale for depression symptoms, goes down. So that's all good. And anxiety measures also go down. So again, it confirms the anecdotes. In a way, this is just a lot of anecdotes collected prospectively. So it's a bit stronger than just anecdotes, but it's a bit similar. We don't have the placebo involved. And you can see here that there's significant increases in resilience, connectedness, nature relatedness, agreeableness, emotional stability. So all positive findings statistically from pre to post. So over time here in these microdoses. So then we can say, but because we don't have placebo, then at least what we can do is try to collect a bit of information about the people's expectations, whether the more that they hoped and thought this could benefit them, was there a relationship between that preset expectation level and the actual outcomes. And there was, after controlling for the baseline well-being scores, the positive expectations to the effects were predictive of greater increases in well-being. So there was this relationship about expectation. That then opens up for, it's even more important and more exciting and interesting to do something with placebo control in order to try to account for that. So, and another little thing about expectation is, what about full doses and expectations? So we actually also have data from that from a depression trial with full doses of psilocybin. And what we see there is, to our surprise, that the expectations of effects of full doses are not actually, in our data, related to the effects of a full dose psilocybin, but the effects of expecting a good outcome of the SSRI treatment in our depression trial was associated with a better outcome. So that means expecting psilocybin in a full dose to work was not related to the outcome, but expecting your SSRI to work, escitalopram, it was related to the outcome, where suggestibility, a bit the other way around, where higher suggestibility was related to higher effects of psilocybin. This is now a step aside into full doses, and I'm stepping back into microdosing. So in terms of microdosing, if we apply a hierarchy of evidence, so up in the top, you have the strongest evidence, which is meta-analysis, where you pull randomized proper trials with placebo together and try to get an overview statistically from the data. That's the highest level of evidence. Down in the bottom of the hierarchy, you have case reports, anecdotes, and And then sort of the more you can kind of see that if you do a cross-sectional, then you go a bit up. But if you do case control, further up, cohort, better, randomized, even better. So that's how you move up this hierarchy of evidence. And then you can, of course, trust data. Typically, the higher they sit in that hierarchy. So in terms of at that point, when we did this work, there were only very little in the lab, including from Harriet, with acute, but very acute single doses with placebo. So there was not anything at that point about repeated doses. So what people actually are doing in the real world with microdosing is taking it over a longer period. So we were like trying to figure out how can we break that problem and try to move up in the hierarchy and do placebo control, but with repeated dosing. And that's where we developed the next survey, which is the self-blinding microdosing survey. The way that worked was, again, people could participate from all over the world. They signed up to an online platform. They gave their consent to participate in this trial/game. And they were basically, again, using their own drug. They were going to do it anyway. So we were not asking them to do it. It was only if we tapped into something they were going to do. But if they consented and followed our manual subsequently of how to participate in the trial, they were basically placebo controlling themselves. So that happened by a fancy manual that Balashiketi developed, and we piloted out, and somebody made a video of how to do it, because that was a bit complicated to do, but it became much easier when people would follow the YouTube video. So people then took their plant microdoses, put them in capsules, they put them in small plastic bags, they put those into envelopes. So each envelope was then containing the equivalent of plant doses for a week. And into each envelope also went a little QR code. And then there was an app on the phone. They then created 8 envelopes, some of them only having placebo, and some have the plant microdosing regime with some placebo mixed into it. It's a bit complicated. Then they mixed up the envelopes in a very specific way in different steps. Then they ended up randomly either putting 4 envelopes aside that contained the actual plant microdosing regime, that was basically what they were going to do anyway from the beginning, or a third of them randomly would end up with a mix where they got 1 week, 1 envelope placebo, so 1 week placebo, 1 week microdosing, and so on. And the last group ended up with placebo in all 4 envelopes, therefore for all 4 weeks. And then we followed them over the 4 weeks, and we followed them for 4 weeks after this in a month follow-up. So that's how it worked. And they could use either LSD or psilocybin. So we had almost 200 completing it, which at that point was the biggest ever placebo-controlled trial with psychedelics. Although it's not a trial, it was a naturalistic study, but with placebo built in, and proper double-blinded in a way, because we obviously sat far away and didn't know, but we had access to break the code from the QR code scanned with their phone. So we could later find out what they actually took in the given weeks they were doing it. So a complete new clinical trial method at that time. And what we see is that mindfulness, one of the outcomes, you can see that mindfulness goes up, which is great. And in a way, it confirms what we had seen before in all the anecdotes, in all the non-controlled prospective surveys and so on that we had and others had been doing. So in a way, this confirms it. But when you look at the placebo, you can see that there's also the people who ended up having the 4 week of placebo and not any microdoses. You also see that they also go up in mindfulness. So, and you can see that there's no significant difference then between that. And that was kind of the case for all the main outcomes in the trial. So there was a lot of improvements, a lot of changes over time. But when you took the placebo into account, similar pattern happened with the people who just did placebo. So if you look at this is related to sort of mood. And if people took placebo, then they had a certain score. And if they took microdosing here, then you see that they had a higher score. However, so this it shows that maybe it works. But the issue is that if people took placebo, sorry, one second. Here they took placebo. So this was actually a placebo, and they guessed it was a placebo. If it actually was a microdosing, but they wrongly guessed that this was placebo, then you don't see any effects. And if they took placebo but wrongly guessed it was a microdosing, then you have the effect. And the same if it was microdosing and they correctly guessed it was a microdose. So you can see that, you look at this data here, you can see that it seems to be driven very much by what people are thinking they're taking rather than what they're actually taking, because you see the big jump, big difference based on what they are guessing. You see down here in the guess line, you see placebo, placebo. That's what they guess. You see they're low here. Here, down here, they guess microdosing, microdosing, and it's high. And this was basically the pattern that we saw across different results in this trial. Apart from when we take the more objective measures, which is a cognitive task, online tasking, then we do not really see such an effect, and we just basically don't see anything really. But we don't see that pattern because obviously there it's less driven by what they think because it's more objective because they're tasking. Most likely that's the reason. So basically we moved up, and then we had Harriet, and then later on the New Zealand with Kate and Robin Murphy and the others doing their study. But now I will rather jump to trying to find out whether we can try to condense the data and understand the discrepancy in how people at the moment are speaking about microdosing. Does it work? Does it not? Are there real effects? Are there not? And I think the jury is still out, but we can try to get a better understanding by trying to condense the data and try to represent it, for instance, visually. So I'll do that according to this pyramid that you saw before, the hierarchy of evidence, where you have the best kind of evidence up in the top that is more rigorously collected, and because it has the placebo control and all that built into it. So what we did was we took all data with microdosing at the time. This is now, this version of it is not the latest, unfortunately. So people that are seeing this later online shouldn't sort of start using and sharing, because this is work in progress, what I'm going to show here. And we are coming with the most updated and triple check version of the plot. But this is basically the equivalent of trying to do a meta-analysis with microdosing, but where the whole idea of how strong is the evidence is built into the way of looking at it. So we basically ranked all the different trials based on what kind of trial it was, and then they were getting scores depending on the quality of the data collection and the quality of the data. So let's just skip this part and then come to the visualization. So basically we call it a Christmas tree plot, where we have the hierarchy shaped like a pyramid or a Christmas tree, and then we decorate it with small little pie charts. And the pie charts, they're colored according to whether the data are showing a benefit from microdosing, or whether they are showing negative effects. And what you see is that down the bottom, look here, there's quite a lot of green colors. So that means it shows benefits all over the Christmas tree. So all over the decoration balls on the Christmas tree, the pie charts. Whereas the red, there's not that much red up here, but basically the green colors are fading out the more you go up in the hierarchy. So that means that, and we have basically diverted the different kinds of data from microdosing science into 4 different categories. So this is affective. That means mood. So depression, anxiety, well-being are sitting over here. Cognitive data, so tasking, attention, focus, memory, and other psychological measures, and then somatics or physical related stuff. And you can see that the pattern is that when you move up in this Christmas tree, it becomes less green. So the statistically convincing evidence supporting any effects of microdosing are kind of disappearing the higher you get in this hierarchy. And that means that is why people get so in disagreement about evidence for microdosing, because there's a lot of evidence that microdosing is great, but it's just from this part of the hierarchy. And the more you go up here, the less there is. then I'll just end here and just say we are doing more microdosing work at Imperial as well. We are keeping on with the more naturalistic, so people using their own drugs and so on, and using the self-blinding model. We are doing a lab-based version of it in London, and then we are also doing a global online survey again, where we are trying to enrich the group a bit like the other two groups are doing. So focus more on people who are actually trying to treat symptoms of depression or anxiety in order not to have a too healthy population in the study. So I will end here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. David, your self-blinding study is so good. It's so smart, I think. The way you did Balaz, however he came up with doing that blinding was quite, quite extraordinary. And, so many people. What was the drug? Did you say, or they just choose their own?
Yeah, so in the beginning, it was easier for us to do it with LSD because that's typically in blotters, so that's simpler to put into all the capsules for people at home. So then when it came to mushroom, then if it's very fresh stuff, it might rotten if we ask them to put them in, and they might not pick it up, and they might be poisoned by, I don't know, rottening fresh mushrooms in a capsule. So we were like, so then we thought, okay, if it's dried mushroom, then it should be safe enough to do it like that. Then we got a burping bias when we were piloting, because when people were burping, then they could basically taste the mushroom. Then we had to find some other material for the placebo condition. So it became, it was kind of a fun thing to develop it together. And Bellas was trying it with friends to find out how to blind it and so on. So, but it ended up working out quite well that people could use both LSD and psilocybin dried mushroom material for it. Yeah.
And do you have sorry, Harriet.
I just have a kind of nerdy question. Usually when we give LSD, we do it sublingually, and you're giving it orally. You're giving it in a capsule on paper orally. So is there any difference in the pharmacokinetics if you take it or ingest it orally?
That's a really good question. I mean, the Matthias Lichty's lab that have done so much pharmacokinetic, I actually not sure that they have tested that in humans, that difference. I actually don't know. I don't know.
Okay, thanks. Okay, thanks.
And, when you've done your surveys, is there a preference for LSD? I get the sense that that's the drug that people prefer to microdose.
It actually is pretty 50-50. Pretty 50-50. There's not in our first survey a little bit more LSD than psilocybin, but it's quite 50-50. And then you have countries where people actually really do much more with the mushrooms, and so it's pretty 50-50 overall. And I think in our trial it was also quite 50-50.
So is it your impression that, I'm sorry, Joe, I should go ahead.
No, absolutely not. No, you're the expert.
I'm just curious, is it your impression that they got the doses, that their estimates of the milligram doses were exactly right and stable and across individuals and across occasions? Or we always worry about purity and about variability and concentrations? And is there anything in your data that could speak to that?
Yeah, so it's a super good question. And in a way, that's why we are now doing another round of it, because we wanted to close that gap. So if you do this kind of study, the problem is that we do not know what they're actually taking. We know what they are self-reported. So when they buy it online or when they do their own regime, they have an idea, but it could be wrong. It could be that they've been lying in the window for 3 years before and they thought that was in it, but there might be nothing in it. So it's a big sort of Achilles heel with this kind of science if we don't know at all objectively what they're measuring. So we tried early on in the trial, or before we started the trial, to go to ethics and say, what about if person in Buenos Aires was in our trial, could they anonymously send with another QR code generated, so they could anonymously send it to us and we could measure it. And we had the Lichty lab in Basel ready to receive it. It was all sorted, but ethics, that's the first time ever I tried ethics, just saying the whole panel, just say, they were very sympathetic, but you just can't, because it's per definition just illegal to send these drugs with the post. So they couldn't approve anything that actually is making people do something illegal, even though nobody would ever find out because it's completely anonymous in the post. They just couldn't approve it. Therefore, we are trying another way to address it in our next trial, where we are implemented a home visit for the London-based side of it, where we will bring some kit, proper measurement kit that can actually quantify the levels. So we will hopefully be doing that very soon. It needs to be approved. We are in the phase of having that approved, but it has been a big headache to how to actually measure, because we can't fully know. The only thing we can know is the self-report, and what, in a way, an advantage, a silver lining of doing what we have been doing compared to the lab-based or the very controlled trials, is that we get a big range, right? And that range, if let's just imagining it was absolutely correct what they self-reported, actually happened to be exactly what they took, then that gives us different things to explore. A bit like when you do 3 different doses in Chicago, we then, in a way, naturally get a range. So when we model the data to try to find out, for instance, at what level in average are people starting becoming better than random at correct guessing what they're taking, which basically will be the threshold for breaking blind. And that ended up, when we modeled the data, being exactly on the microgram, the same as what you found in your lab, which is kind of interesting. So that doesn't mean that we know that the doses were correct, but you have that silver lining that it allows you to actually model the data and try to use these things.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I want to talk a little bit of pharmacology, David, because last time I saw you talk about this, did you say that there'd been some receptor occupancy study of PET imaging or something to show that the drugs, they were hitting the receptor?
Yeah, so the study, I had one slide with it here as well, but they have so in Copenhagen, where I did my PhD before moving to London, they do a lot of PET, and they actually did do such a study with different doses of psilocybin, and now they are doing it with LSD, so that's coming relatively soon. So they are doing occupancy plots, which basically is different doses. How much does a given dose actually occupy on this psychedelic serotonin 2A receptor? And so they did a very beautiful plot with psilocybin, and now we are waiting for equally, hopefully, beautiful plot with LSD. And that's actually really useful. I think, and when you then look at the range that people are doing out in naturalistic setting or microdosing, when you look at where that sits on that plot, then basically it goes up to around more than 40% of occupancy, which is proper occupancy of the receptors, therefore theoretically a pharmacological effect. And another thing on that note is, I forgot what it was with the occupancy. Yeah.
The EEG study that you did, Harriet, as well, does suggest that you're getting, some efficacy CNS effects.
Yeah. I interpret all these data quite cautiously because of the individual differences too in response to the drug, and there's a lot of variability even in plasma levels. So not only is variability that in absorption, so plasma levels that people get, and then also even at the same plasma levels, there's variability in responses. So it's enormously hard work to do without a very large number of subjects to take into account. We do get plasma levels as we go now because we're concerned about that.
And it was great to hear you talk about the 5-HT2B receptor occupancy, David, because when people ask me about the safety of psychedelics, it does seem that a couple of high doses in the clinical trials, it's pretty safe. And the way that people tend to use psychedelics from the Global Drug Survey a couple of times a year, that it's not a repeated dose, but this is a repeated dose. And and that is a real concern because those drugs have got a high affinity for the 2B receptor, and LSD is the same. Psilocin, the affinity for the 2B receptor is pretty much the same as many of those drugs that have been withdrawn because of heart valve toxicity and fibrosis and, cardiovascular problems. So, to my mind, there's the risk. But I absolutely think that we need people, doing the microdosing work. They must do this safety work.
Yeah, I really, really agree. And I think if you were a regulatory body who were in a way giving thumbs up for clinical development for microdosing for a company who would want to do that, when it comes to the standard batteries of safety testing in animals, you would in a way hope that they would put it in as a requirement that they actually need to be some heart valve studies specifically for drugs that are 2B serotonin receptor 2B active, right? And I don't know if Harriet or Kate or you know whether there are any thoughts about in a way putting it a bit as a demand, because if a company is not asked to do it, it's very expensive stuff to do.
Yeah.
If they're not in a way asked, okay, this is part of the package you need to show before we are gonna let you go crazy in big trials. So I'm a little bit surprised that we haven't seen any such data yet. Hopefully somebody is doing it. My guess it might be an academic group that will do it. But it should actually be the company, if you ask me.
And I'm thinking that academic groups are doing microdosing studies in rats, in animals, aren't they? And could, at the end of the study, keep the tissues and send them away. But that's not something an academic can pay for.
No.
It's like you say, it's all really expensive. But the collaborative work probably would be the way to do this. But it certainly is a potential issue, I think.
Yeah.
And you talking about how difficult it is, for you to test the drugs, to find out exactly the dose that people are taking. Just to tell people, this is a complete nightmare in the UK. I guess it is in the States as well. Clearly not in New Zealand, which is great, but the scheduling and the laws here make this research they make all research with, psychedelic drugs incredibly difficult and much more expensive than they should be. So that's really, a frustration that we all share.
I know even with the New Zealand study to test the microdosing substances, they've now got it approved, but that was a very lengthy process. And even despite the country being quite good at testing at festivals and that kind of thing, the laws are technically in place to allow for it, but the granting of the license to actually do it is seemingly deliberately slow to grant. And so even if the legislation is there, it's still a process to get it approved to actually do it.
Yeah, it's an awful process in this country. Yeah. So somebody was asking, Kira was asking how she can get involved in your microdosing trial.
I sent the link to the website in response to that question. So
did you?
anyway,
Brilliant.
and it's for both the worldwide and the London-based branch.
Thank you so much.
Perfect.
So have you all got, sorry. Sorry. Have you all got a take-home message for us? Put you on the spot.
I have one, and that is evidence is not evidence, because microdosing is the perfect example of how confusing the conversation is when people are comparing apples to bananas. People need to be a little bit critical, a little bit curious about kinds of evidence before they conclude anything about effects. It's so hyped, it's so popular, to run away. If the possibility that Harriet was also talking about, the potential for placebo effects are massive when you have something with that degree of expectation, with that amount of context change and environment, lifestyle changes mixed into it. We need to be sound and boring and scientific about microdosing, and people should be a little bit critical before they conclude that much, and maybe look at the Christmas tree when it comes.
Brilliant. Yeah, absolutely. People should be much more critical. Harriet?
I'm just, I have a next study that I'm not going to do, but I want somebody to do, and that's to do microdosing with a stimulant, with amphetamine or methamphetamine, and just because we see these little bit of a stimulant-like effect acutely, and they dissipate over time. But that little bit of stimulant effect, it looks very much like what we see when we give an amphetamine, and it could convince people that they're experiencing something good, and there may even be a biological basis to that. But I would be very interested in seeing very low doses of amphetamine in this context with all the expectation and hype. Here we are. Anyway.
Okay.
Something for someone to do.
So, yeah, maybe Imperial will do that.
Now, maybe it's a good idea, but it's controversial to start. No, it's not controversial because it's a very, very scientifically meaningful thing.
Uh,
But because of amphetamine, it's not really something anyone want to develop because of the dependence and dopamine and that. But it's very interesting to see whether you would actually see exactly the same. And also to the person who asked the question to Harriet about what about caffeine? You know, yeah. So at least we need to be more convinced. I think we can all, don't we all agree? We simply need to be more convinced about data from microdosing because we can't say that much convincingly about how beneficial it is right now. There's
I
more.
think we're all optimistic. We're all open-minded to seeing that there might be something there. It's going to be subtle, but it's our job to try and figure out what exactly it is and then what conditions you see it.
and absolutely. And as your data with people with low mood was very interesting, Harriet. That was quite convincing. Kate?
Oh, sorry.
No, you go, David.
I'll just say that it is, but remember that when we know that people overall are able to break the blind and perceive that they actually get the doses of 26 microgram, that's a dose that most people can perceive. Then again, it means that if people are really, really convinced that this has to work for them, then that dose that people can feel, it's very difficult to dangle what could be. What do you say, Harriet?
We asked people at the end what they thought they got. So I could easily go back and see whether those depressed people were more accurate in labeling this drug if they felt anything as a psychedelic compared to anything else. Of course, they're going into this thinking they might get a stimulant, a tranquilizer, any of like 6 different categories of drugs. So if they experience a little bit of drug effect, they're not going to say immediately this is a psychedelic. So
that's true, because you had it very smartly designed with all the and but in a way, what was quite interesting was that the ones that benefited, they had the mystical type, the peak experience measure were much
Amazing.
higher. So that gives an indication that maybe they could actually feel it as a psychedelic. Anyway, it's interesting to see.
We can go back and look at what they labeled it, but I don't think there's a relationship between the psychedelic feelings, and we can easily look at it. Thank you.
Thanks.
It's quite interesting how the blinding discussion is more so present in the microdosing field when it's actually the high dose studies. You're way more affected by that. But in microdosing, we're so particular about if we're wanting them to be sub-threshold, but maybe actually part of that feeling of having the microdose is like facilitating the effects. So maybe we shouldn't be so critical.
I don't know who came up with the idea that microdosing has to be sub-perceptual threshold. I mean, people are doing it in the real world, and they might very well be experiencing a little bit of something, and that might very well contribute to their feelings of well-being apart from expectancies. So I don't know why we set this gold standard of having to have it, that it's only a pure microdose if you can't feel it at all. So anyway.
I agree, definitely. And then it's aligned with the take forwards from the other study of maybe you should be able to feel it, and maybe you should then, go to the beach with your family and have an enriching environment during it, or do it during a therapeutic session. It doesn't have to be this microdosing community that is so not therapeutically aligned, and it has to be an SSRI model. It's kind of, it's funny.
Yeah, it's so interesting, and we have a lot to learn, I think.
I'd say my takeaway before we wrap up, I would leave on a more positive note of that. While the microdosing grey literature can definitely get a bit out of hand and be quite hype-centric, I'd say the researchers working in the microdosing research field are like some of the best in the psychedelic space. It's all very much like grounded in evidence-based research, while also being like cautiously optimistic at the same time. So it's sort of I quite enjoy the microdosing space of the psychedelic research field. It's quite an interesting place to be in, and I think there are really extraordinary researchers, including Harriet and David and Suresh. And
Oh, absolutely, and that struck me. You have these fantastic scientists doing the trials. And just one final thing about time of day, because we had an event last night, and one of the women was talking about microdosing. and at night before she went to bed. Is that common?
I would say no. And I'd also say with the stimulant-like effects, it would be odd that they could get to sleep even, which was the rationale for ours being a midday cutoff, was to not affect sleep negatively.
Yeah, I mean, all ADHD medications, morning, normal SSRIs, morning, most people microdosing morning. So people who take mirtazapine for depression, they take it at night because it's right. So yeah, my sense is that people take it in the morning more often. People typically take it at night.
Especially with the jittery effects.
Yeah.
You know, that you saw on the stimulation and all that. Anyway, we should let you go. Thank you so much for taking part in this. And our participants have stayed. So that doesn't always happen. Very often people have to leave. And so we've got a very committed audience here and some great questions from you, the audience. So thank you all very much for coming and for making this such a lively discussion, because there is a lot of discussion and debate about this. And I really look forward to the data from the next trials. There's clearly loads going on in this space. Getting it funded, doing remarkably well to get it funded. That must be so hard.
Yes. Joe, thanks for organizing it. Lots of interesting conversation, interesting discussion. I learned a lot.
I think it's so interesting. It's brilliant. Thank you so much, everybody. So that's it from us. I'm going to close this down now. It's 6:00. Oh, we've done really well. And I can see the thank yous coming in on the chat. Clearly, people have really enjoyed this and have learned a lot. And I've certainly learned an awful lot. So, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.